Harlem, New York. It was 4:37 p.m. on Tuesday, February 4th, 1947, the temperature hovering around 18 degrees with wind that cut through clothing like knives, when Bumpy Johnson's black Cadillac turned onto Lenox Avenue, heading toward his office above the Palm Cafe, and the driver had to slow down because an elderly colored woman was standing in the middle of the street, not moving, not getting out of the way, just standing there with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, wearing a thin house dress that was completely inadequate for February weather, and no coat at all, her gray hair uncombed, her face showing a fresh bruise across her left cheek that was purple and swollen, and when Johnson's driver honked the horn to get her to move, she didn't move. She just looked directly at the Cadillac's back window where Johnson sat and raised one hand in a gesture that wasn't threatening but was pleading, desperate, the gesture of someone who had nothing left to lose and who was making one final attempt to survive before giving up entirely. Johnson told his driver to stop. His bodyguard, William "Bub" Hewlett, immediately tensed, hand moving toward the .45 automatic he carried in a shoulder holster, because standing in the street to stop Johnson's car was exactly how assassins might set up an ambush, how competitors had tried to kill Johnson twice before, and Hewlett's job was to assume every unexpected situation was potentially fatal. But Johnson waved Hewlett off, rolled down the window, and called to the woman, "Ma'am, you're standing in the middle of the street in the freezing cold with no coat on. What's wrong? You need help?" The woman walked slowly to the car, moving like every step hurt, like her body was giving out, and when she reached the window, Johnson could see that the bruise on her face was fresh, maybe a day old at most, and that she was shivering so badly her words came out broken and stuttering. "Mr. Johnson, sir, I know who you are. Everybody in Harlem knows who you are. I'm sorry to stop your car like this, but I didn't know what else to do. I haven't eaten in 3 days. My electricity's been off for a week. My heat's been off for 10 days. I'm living in my apartment with no power, no heat, in this cold, and I can't afford to buy food. I came out here because I was hoping maybe if I could find you, you might help me. Just one bread, Mr. Johnson. That's all I need. Just one bread so I can eat something, please." Johnson stared at this woman. She was probably 70 years old, maybe older, her face weathered from decades of poverty and hardship, wearing a dress that had been washed so many times it was nearly threadbare, with house slippers on her feet instead of proper shoes. And he felt something that he didn't often feel, something that cut through the armor of indifference that 30 years as a criminal had built around his emotions. This wasn't someone asking for help to gamble, wasn't someone looking for a handout. Because they were lazy, wasn't someone trying to work an angle. This was a Harlem grandmother who was literally freezing and starving in her own apartment, and who was so desperate that she'd stopped a gangster's car in the middle of the street to beg for a single loaf of bread. "Ma'am, get in the car," Johnson said, opening the door. "You're going to freeze to death out here." The woman hesitated, clearly frightened of getting into a car with Bumpy Johnson and his bodyguard, but the cold won out over fear, and she climbed into the warm interior, immediately starting to cry from the relief of being out of the wind. Johnson took off his own overcoat, an expensive camel hair coat that had cost him $300, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked gently. "Elizabeth Carter," she said through chattering teeth. "I live at 347 West 134th Street, apartment 4B. I'm 72 years old. I've lived in Harlem for 43 years, since I came up from Virginia in 1904. I worked as a domestic for white families downtown until I got too old to work 5 years ago. Now I live on nothing. No pension, no savings, nothing. The city welfare gives me $11 a month, but my rent is $8, so that leaves me $3 for everything else. Food, electricity, heat, everything. I've been managing, been getting by, but this winter's been so cold, and the electric company shut off my power because I couldn't pay. And then the landlord shut off my heat because he says I owe him back rent, and I don't have any money, and I haven't eaten since Sunday. And I just needed one bread, just something to eat. And I knew you help people sometimes, Mr. Johnson. I heard stories about how you help people. So I thought maybe if I could find you, you might give me just one bread. Johnson was quiet for a moment, processing what he was hearing. $3 a month after rent. $3 to cover food, electricity, heat, clothing, medicine, everything a human being needs to survive. And this woman had been managing on that, had been surviving somehow until this winter when the cold became too much, and the bills she couldn't pay stacked up, and now she was freezing and starving in her apartment with no way out. The reality of Elizabeth Carter's existence hit Johnson hard, not because he was naive about poverty. He'd seen poverty his entire life, had grown up in it himself in South Carolina, where his family had often gone hungry, but because sitting here in his heated Cadillac, wearing a $300 overcoat with a $20,000 diamond ring on his finger, having just collected $15,000 in policy gambling profits that morning, the contrast between his wealth and this woman's destitution was so stark that it forced him to confront exactly what kind of society produced both simultaneously. But there was something else. That bruise on her face, fresh, recent, inflicted within the last day or so. Johnson had seen enough violence in his life to know what a bruise from being hit looked like. And that bruise on Elizabeth Carter's face had come from someone's hand, from someone striking her deliberately and with force. "Mrs. Carter," Johnson said carefully, "that bruise on your face, how'd you get that?" Elizabeth looked down, embarrassed, ashamed. "It's nothing, Mr. Johnson, just an accident. I fell." "Mrs. Carter," Johnson said again, his voice still gentle but with an edge of steel underneath. "I've been in this life long enough to know what accidents look like and what being hit looks like. Somebody hit you. Who was it?" Elizabeth started crying again, harder this time, the kind of crying that comes from shame and humiliation and from holding in pain for too long. The story came out in fragments, between sobs, the kind of confession that people make when they've been carrying a terrible secret alone for so long that the relief of finally telling someone overwhelms their shame about revealing it. "My son," she finally said. "My son Edward. He's 43 years old and he's an alcoholic. He's been drinking since he was 17, lost every job he ever had because of it, can't keep a place to live, sleeps on the streets most nights or in flop houses when he's got money for a bed. He comes to my apartment sometimes asking for money to buy liquor, and when I tell him I don't have any money, he gets angry. He gets mean. 2 days ago, he came knocking on my door at 3 a.m, so drunk he could barely stand, demanding money. I told him I didn't have anything to give him, that I was barely surviving myself, that I couldn't give him money for drinking when I didn't have money for food. And he hit me, knocked me down. I fell against the kitchen table and hurt my hip. Then he searched my apartment until he found the dollar I had hidden in a coffee can for absolute emergencies, and he took it and left. I haven't seen him since." Johnson's face went cold in a way that made Hewlett glance over from the front seat, recognizing the expression that meant Johnson was about to do something violent. Hewlett had seen that expression before, had seen it right before Johnson killed a man who'd cheated elderly people in a housing scam, had seen it before Johnson beat a pimp so badly the man spent 3 months in the hospital after Johnson learned he was forcing 14-year-old girls into prostitution. That expression meant someone had crossed a line that Johnson wouldn't tolerate, that someone was about to face consequences that would be severe and immediate and completely without mercy. But Johnson's voice remained calm when he spoke to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to tell me about your son. Not about the drinking, not about what he did 2 days ago. Tell me about who he was before the alcohol destroyed him. Tell me about the man he used to be." Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the sleeve of Johnson's overcoat, seemed confused by the question, but answered anyway. "Edward was a good boy. Smart, too. He finished high school, one of the few colored boys in his class who did. He wanted to be a teacher, wanted to teach mathematics because he was always so good with numbers. But there weren't any teaching positions for colored men, not real ones anyway. So he took whatever work he could find. He worked on the docks for a while, worked in factories, worked as a janitor in office buildings downtown. But the work was hard, and the pay was terrible, and the white men he worked with treated him like he was stupid, even though he was smarter than most of them. And somewhere along the way, Edward started drinking. At first, it was just a little, just to take the edge off after hard days. But then it was more, and then it was all the time. He lost his job at the docks because he showed up drunk. Lost the factory job because he got into a fight with a foreman who called him a racial slur. After that, nobody would hire him. He's been on the streets for almost 15 years now, living like an animal, drinking away whatever money he can beg or steal. And I've watched my boy, my smart, kind boy who wanted to be a teacher, turn into someone I don't recognize anymore." She paused, looking directly at Johnson. "But you want to know something, Mr. Johnson? I still see flashes of who he used to be. Sometimes when he comes to visit, and he's sober for a few hours, I see the Edward I raised, the boy who used to help me carry groceries up 4 flights of stairs, the young man who used to read to me from newspapers because my eyes weren't as good as his. He's still in there somewhere, buried under the alcohol and the anger and the shame. But I don't know how to reach him anymore. I'm too old, too poor, too tired. And now he's hurting me, and I don't know what to do about it." Johnson pulled out his wallet, removed 5 $20 bills, $100 total, and handed them to Elizabeth. She stared at the money like it was something from another planet, more money than she'd seen in years, more money than she could process. "Mr. Johnson, I can't take this. I just asked for 1 bread. This is too much." "Mrs. Carter, you take that money," Johnson said firmly. "You go pay your electric bill today, right now, as soon as we get you home. You pay your landlord what you owe him, so he turns your heat back on. You buy yourself a warm coat and proper shoes because you can't go through the rest of this winter in a house dress and slippers. You buy groceries, real groceries, not just bread, but meat and vegetables and things that'll keep you strong. You buy whatever medicine you need for that hip you hurt when Edward knocked you down. And whatever's left after all that, you keep for emergencies. You understand? This isn't charity, Mrs. Carter. Consider it payment for all those years you worked for white families downtown who probably paid you pennies and treated you terribly. Consider it payment that this city should have given you decades ago but never did. You take this money and you use it to survive because you deserve to survive and you've earned the right to live with dignity in your old age." Elizabeth clutched the money with shaking hands, tears streaming down her weathered face. "God bless you, Mr. Johnson. God bless you. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know what I did to deserve this kindness." "You didn't have to do anything to deserve it," Johnson said. "You're a Harlem woman who worked your whole life and who's being left to freeze and starve because this country doesn't take care of its elderly. That's not right. That's not fair. And if I can help fix it, even just for one person, then I'm going to help." He paused, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But, Mrs. Carter, you listen to me carefully now. You don't give a single dollar of that money to your son if he comes around. Not $1. That money is for you, to keep you alive, to keep you from freezing in your apartment. If Edward comes asking for money, you tell him no. You tell him his mother doesn't have anything to give him. You understand? Because if you give him that money, he'll drink it away in 2 days, and then you'll be right back where you were, freezing and starving, and I can't keep giving you money every week. So you promise me, that money stays with you and doesn't go to Edward." Elizabeth nodded vigorously. "I promise, Mr. Johnson. I promise. I won't give him any of it. I'll use it for myself, exactly like you said." Johnson told his driver to take Elizabeth home to 347 West 134th Street to wait while she went upstairs to put the money somewhere safe, and then to take her to the electric company office where she could pay her bill and get her power restored. After that, take her wherever she needs to go, grocery store, clothing store, wherever. You make sure she gets home safe with everything she bought, and you make sure nobody bothers her. You understand?" The driver nodded. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. I'll take care of it." Johnson turned back to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Carter, you go do what you need to do. Get your power back on, get your heat back, get yourself warm and fed. I'm going to handle the situation with your son. I'm going to have a conversation with Edward about what happened 2 days ago, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Elizabeth's face showed fear. "Mr. Johnson, please don't hurt him. I know what he did was wrong. I know he shouldn't have hit me, but he's sick. The drinking has made him sick. He's not a bad man. He's just a sick man." Johnson's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Carter, I'm not going to kill your son. I'm not going to put him in the hospital. But I am going to make very clear to him that hitting his 72-year-old mother is unacceptable, and that if it happens again, there will be consequences he won't survive. And I'm going to do something else too. I'm going to try to help him, if he'll let me help him. But first I need to find him. Where does your son usually go when he's drinking? Where can I find him this time of day?" Elizabeth hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to protect her son and understanding that Johnson was going to find Edward, regardless of whether she helped. "There's a place on 133rd Street between Lenox and 7th Avenue, she finally said quietly. "An alley behind Cohen's liquor store where the drunks gather when they've got money to drink. Edward's usually there in the afternoons, if he's managed to get money somehow. If he doesn't have money for liquor, he's down by the docks trying to rob people coming off shift, or he's stealing things from stores to sell to the fence on 142nd Street. But the alley behind Cohen's is where he goes when he's got a bottle, so that's probably where he is now if he still has any of my dollar left." Johnson nodded. "All right. You go take care of yourself, Mrs. Carter. Get warm, get fed, and don't worry about Edward. I'll handle it." He climbed out of the Cadillac, then leaned back in through the window. "And, Mrs. Carter, if Edward comes around again demanding money or causing problems, you send someone to find me. You tell them to go to the Palm Cafe and tell whoever's there that Mrs. Elizabeth Carter on 134th Street needs Bumpy Johnson. Someone will find me, and I'll come help. You don't have to be afraid of your son anymore. That's over, as of today." Elizabeth nodded, still crying, still clutching the $100 like it might disappear if she let go. As the Cadillac pulled away, taking her home, Johnson turned to Hewlett. "Bub, you and me are taking a walk to 133rd Street. We need to have a conversation with Mrs. Carter's son about respecting his mother." They walked the 6 blocks to Cohen's liquor store in silence. Johnson's face set in that cold expression that Hewlett had learned over 2 decades meant Johnson was beyond angry, was in that state of controlled fury where violence was inevitable, and the only question was how severe it would be. The alley behind Cohen's was exactly what Elizabeth had described, a narrow passage between two buildings where sunlight barely reached, where garbage was piled in corners and where broken bottles covered the ground, where four men sat on cardboard boxes, passing bottles wrapped in paper bags between them, all of them in various stages of intoxication that ranged from pleasantly drunk to barely conscious. Edward Carter was the second man from the left, sitting with his back against the brick wall, a bottle of cheap whiskey clutched in his right hand, his clothes filthy and torn, his face unshaven for at least a week, his hands shaking from alcohol withdrawal or from the cold or both. He was in the middle of telling some story to the other drunks, something about a fight he'd supposedly won years ago. His words slurred and his gestures exaggerated, the way drunks' gestures become when they're trying to convince themselves that their lives have meaning and that their stories matter. The other men saw Johnson and Hewlett first. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson by sight, and Hewlett's massive frame and the bulge of the .45 under his jacket made it clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with, and they immediately scrambled to their feet and backed away, understanding with the instinctive survival sense that chronic drunks develop that when Bumpy Johnson appeared with his enforcer, there was about to be trouble, and they didn't want any part of it. Edward, too drunk to notice what was happening, kept talking, kept gesturing with his bottle, kept telling his story that nobody was listening to anymore until Johnson's shadow fell across him and blocked what little sunlight reached into the alley. Edward looked up, squinting against the sudden change in light, trying to focus on who was standing over him. His alcohol-fogged brain took several seconds to process what he was seeing, to recognize Bumpy Johnson's face, to understand that this was serious, that this was dangerous, that something very bad was about to happen. Edward tried to stand up, tried to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, and he only managed to knock over his bottle, spilling the remaining whiskey across the filthy ground. "Edward Carter?" Johnson asked, his voice quiet and deadly calm. "Yeah, that's me," Edward managed to say, his words slurred. Who's asking?" Johnson reached down, grabbed Edward by the front of his shirt, and lifted him to his feet with one smooth motion that demonstrated strength that a 42-year-old man shouldn't possess, but that Johnson had maintained through decades of physical violence. Edward suddenly realized who was holding him, realized that Bumpy Johnson himself was here in this alley, was holding him, was looking at him with eyes that promised violence, and Edward's alcohol-clouded mind cleared just enough to understand that this was about something serious, that he'd done something to attract the attention of Harlem's most dangerous man. "Your mother is 72 years old," Johnson said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the confined space of the alley. "She weighs maybe 90 pounds soaking wet. She's living in an apartment with no electricity, no heat, in the middle of February when it's 18 degrees outside. She's surviving on $3 a month after she pays rent. $3 to cover food, medicine, everything a person needs to live. She hasn't eaten in 3 days. She's wearing a thin house dress and slippers because she can't afford a coat or proper shoes. And 2 days ago, you went to her apartment at 3 in the morning, drunk off your ass, demanding money. When she told you she didn't have any money to give you, you hit her. You hit your 72-year-old mother who was already starving and freezing. You knocked her down, hurt her hip, left a bruise on her face the size of my hand. Then you searched her apartment until you found the single dollar she'd been hiding for absolute emergencies, and you stole it so you could buy the liquor you're drinking right now." Edward's face went pale underneath the grime. Fear cut through the alcohol fog like a knife. His mouth opened and closed, But no words came out, because what could he possibly say that would make any of this better? What excuse could he possibly offer for hitting his own mother and stealing from her when she had nothing? "I didn't mean to," Edward finally managed. I was drunk and I needed—" Johnson's right hand came up so fast, Edward didn't see it coming. The slap connected with Edward's face with a sound like a firecracker going off in the confined space of the alley, snapping Edward's head to the side, splitting his lip, sending blood running down his chin and neck. Edward cried out in pain and shock, tried to cover his face with his hands, but Johnson grabbed him again and pulled him close, so close their faces were inches apart, so close Edward could smell the expensive Cuban cigar on Johnson's breath and could see the absolutely cold fury in Johnson's eyes. "That's the last time you ever touch your mother," Johnson said, each word clear and distinct and heavy with threat that wasn't implied but was promised. "The absolute last time. You understand me? You don't ask her for money. You don't go to her apartment when you're drunk. You don't bother her. You don't upset her. You don't steal from her. You don't so much as raise your voice to her ever again. Because if I hear that you've touched her, if I hear that you've taken anything from her, if I hear that you've upset her in any way whatsoever, I will find you. And, brother, I can find anyone in Harlem, and I will hurt you in ways that will make you wish you'd never been born. I will break bones that you didn't know you had. I will make you feel pain that you can't imagine. And then, after you heal, if you heal, I'll come back and do it again. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Edward? Do you understand that this is the only warning you're going to get?" Edward was crying now, blood and tears and snot running down his face, his body shaking not just from alcohol withdrawal, but from genuine terror, because he understood that Bumpy Johnson wasn't making empty threats, that Johnson had killed men for far less than what Edward had done, and that the only reason Edward was still alive was because Johnson had decided, for some reason, to give him one chance to change. "I understand, Mr. Johnson," Edward sobbed. "I understand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did it. I was drunk, and I wasn't thinking, and I just needed money for a drink, and I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear I didn't mean to hurt her." "Sorry doesn't mean anything," Johnson said, his grip on Edward's shirt not loosening. "Sorry is just words, just sounds that come out of your mouth when you want people to stop being mad at you. Sorry doesn't fix what you did. Sorry doesn't heal the bruise on your mother's face or give her back the dollar you stole or undo the fact that you knocked down a 72-year-old woman who'd been starving for 3 days. What matters isn't whether you're sorry now. What matters is what you do from this moment forward. What matters is whether you become a different person or whether you keep being the piece of garbage who hits his mother for liquor money." Johnson released Edward suddenly, let him stumble backward against the alley wall, let him wipe the blood from his mouth with a shaking hand that was so unsteady from alcohol withdrawal that he could barely perform the simple task. Edward just stood there crying, unable to respond, unable to defend himself because Johnson was right about everything, because Edward knew exactly what he'd become and hated himself for it, but couldn't stop, couldn't change, couldn't do anything except keep drinking until eventually he'd drink himself to death in some alley just like this one. "You're 43 years old," Johnson continued, his voice still quiet but now with something else underneath, something that might have been pity or might have been contempt or might have been both. "You're killing yourself with alcohol. You're living like an animal in alleys and flop houses. You're beating up your own mother for liquor money. That's pathetic. That's the life of a man who's already dead. He just hasn't laid down yet. You're what happens when a smart man gives up, when a man who could have been a teacher decides it's easier to drink than to fight, When someone who had potential decides that potential doesn't matter if the world isn't fair. Edward looked up at Johnson through blood and tears. "What do you know about it? What do you know about being a colored man in this city?" "I finished high school, Mr. Johnson. I was good at mathematics. I could have been a teacher, but there weren't any teaching jobs for colored men. So I worked on the docks, hauling cargo for white men who treated me like I was stupid. I worked in factories doing dangerous work for half what white men got paid. I worked as a janitor in office buildings, cleaning up after people who wouldn't shake my hand if I offered it. I did everything right, and it didn't matter, because this country doesn't give a damn about colored men who try to better themselves. So yeah, I started drinking. Because what's the point of being sober and watching your life go nowhere? What's the point of staying clean when you're never going to be anything anyway?" Johnson stared at Edward for a long moment. "You want to know what I know about being a colored man in this city? I grew up in South Carolina picking cotton for white men who thought they owned us even after slavery ended. My family went hungry so often I can't remember all the times. We lived in a shack with no electricity, no running water, nothing but poverty and hunger and white people's contempt. I came to Harlem in 1919 with nothing, no education, no skills, no money, nothing but a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. And you know what I learned? I learned that this country is exactly as unfair as you say it is. I learned that colored men don't get the opportunities they deserve, don't get treated with respect, don't get a fair chance to succeed through legitimate work. I learned all of that, Edward. I learned it the same way you did." He took a step closer to Edward. "But here's what else I learned. I learned that you can either accept that unfairness and let it destroy you, or you can find a way to survive anyway. You can either drink yourself to death in an alley feeling sorry for yourself, or you can figure out how to make a life despite the obstacles. I'm a criminal, Edward. I run policy gambling. I distribute narcotics. I hurt people when they threaten my business. I'm not a good man, and I'm not someone you should admire. But I'm also not a drunk who hits his mother. I'm not someone who gave up. I found a way to survive in an unfair world, and yeah, the way I found wasn't legal and wasn't moral, but it was a way. And you could have found a way, too, if you'd kept fighting instead of giving up and climbing into a bottle." Edward slumped against the wall, Johnson's words hitting harder than the slap had, because Johnson was right, because Edward had given up, had decided that drinking was easier than fighting, had chosen the bottle over the struggle because the struggle seemed endless and pointless, and the bottle provided temporary escape from having to care about any of it. "But here's what's going to happen," Johnson continued, his voice taking on a different quality now, something that was almost gentle, something that suggested this wasn't just about punishment, but about possibility. "Tomorrow morning at 6:30, you're going to show up at Sam's restaurant on 135th Street and Lenox. You know where that is?" Edward nodded weakly. He knew Sam's. Everyone in Harlem knew Sam's. It was a busy restaurant that served breakfast and lunch to working people, a legitimate business that had been operating for 20 years. "Sam's a friend of mine," Johnson said. "He owes me favors. More importantly, he's a good man who believes that people deserve second chances if they're willing to work for them. Sam needs someone to haul ice blocks from the delivery truck to the ice house in the back every morning. He needs someone to carry food supplies, sacks of flour, bags of rice, crates of vegetables, from deliveries to the storage room. He needs someone to wash dishes, to mop floors, to take out garbage, to do all the physical labor that keeps a restaurant running. It's hard work. It's honest work. It pays $25 a week. Not much, but more than you're making now stealing and begging. You're going to show up at 6:30 tomorrow morning. You're going to tell Sam that Bumpy sent you, and you're going to work every day, 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, 6:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. You work hard, you keep your mouth shut, you don't cause problems, and every Friday, Sam will pay you $25 in cash. Edward stared at Johnson like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. A job, real work, $25 a week. It had been years since anyone had offered him legitimate work, years since anyone had looked at him as anything other than a worthless drunk who should be avoided or pitied. Why? Edward managed to ask through his tears and his split lip. Why would you do this for me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I'm a drunk who hits his mother. Why would you give me a job? I'm not giving you a job, Johnson said flatly. Sam's giving you a job, and he's doing it because I asked him to, and because he's the kind of man who believes people can change if they're given a reason to. And you're not doing this for you. You're doing it for your mother. That woman spent 72 years surviving in a country that didn't want her to survive. She worked herself to exhaustion for white families who paid her pennies and treated her like she was invisible. She raised you by herself after your father left, put food on the table when there wasn't enough food, kept a roof over your head when there wasn't enough money for rent. She did all of that, and now she's living in poverty because this country doesn't give a damn about elderly colored women who've worked their whole lives. She deserves better than to be beaten by her alcoholic son. She deserves better than to starve while you drink. So you're going to give her better. You're going to show up tomorrow at 6:30, you're going to work hard, and you're going to become the son she deserves instead of the man you've been. Johnson reached into his pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and held it out to Edward. Here's $10. You go find a place that'll let you clean up, a bathhouse, a YMCA, somewhere. You wash yourself. You shave. You make yourself look like someone who's capable of working instead of looking like someone who sleeps in alleys. Then you find somewhere to sleep tonight that's not an alley. Get a bed in a flophouse, somewhere warm where you can rest. Do not spend this money on alcohol. Do not stop at a liquor store. Do not buy a bottle. This is for cleaning up and for sleeping, period. You show up tomorrow at Sam's, looking clean and sober, and you get a chance to turn your life around. You show up drunk, or you don't show up at all, and I come looking for you, and what happens next won't be a conversation. You understand the difference? Edward took the $10 with shaking hands, stared at it like it was a lifeline being thrown to a drowning man, like it represented possibility that he'd thought was gone forever. I'll be there, he said quietly. I'll be clean and sober and ready to work. I promise. Don't promise me, Johnson said. Promise your mother. Promise the woman who's living in an apartment with no heat and no electricity because she gave everything she had to raise you. Promise her that you're going to be better. And then show up tomorrow and prove that your promise means something. Johnson turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Edward one more time. One more thing. Out of that $25 you'll be earning every week, you're going to give $10 to your mother. Every Friday, right after Sam pays you, you're going to walk to her apartment and you're going to give her $10 to help with her bills. That leaves you $15 a week for yourself, for food, for a place to sleep, for whatever you need. If you want to drink away that $15, that's your choice. I can't stop you from drinking, and I'm not going to try, but that $10 goes to your mother every week without fail. You miss one payment, you fail to show up one Friday with her money, and we're going to have another conversation, and that conversation won't end with you walking away. Do you understand? I understand, Edward said. $10 every Friday to my mother. I'll do it. I swear I'll do it. 6:30 tomorrow morning, Johnson said. Sam's restaurant. Don't make me come looking for you. Edward Carter didn't sleep that night. He walked to the public bathhouse on 127th Street, paid 50 cents for hot water and soap, and spent an hour scrubbing away weeks of dirt and grime, watching the water run black and then gray and finally clear as he made himself clean for the first time in longer than he could remember. He found a barber shop that was still open at 8 p.m., paid $1 for a shave, watched decades of beard fall away to reveal the face he used to have before alcohol had bloated and reddened it. He looked at himself in the barber's mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, still thin, still showing the damage that 15 years of drinking had inflicted, but human again, someone who looked like he might be capable of holding a job instead of looking like someone who'd given up entirely. He spent $3 on a bed in a flophouse on 152nd Street, a tiny room with a thin mattress and a shared bathroom down the hall, but clean sheets and a lock on the door and heat that actually worked. He lay awake most of the night, his body screaming for alcohol, his hands shaking so badly he had to hold them together to keep them still, his mind racing with fear and hope and terror that he'd somehow fail this chance that Bumpy Johnson had given him, that he'd show up drunk or wouldn't show up at all and would prove that he was exactly the worthless drunk everyone believed he was. At 5:30 a.m., Edward gave up trying to sleep. He washed his face in the communal bathroom, put on the same clothes he'd been wearing, still dirty but the best he had, and walked through pre-dawn Harlem streets toward Sam's restaurant. He arrived at 6:15, 15 minutes early, and stood outside in the February cold, watching through the window as Sam and 2 other workers prepared for the breakfast rush as they fired up the griddles and organized the kitchen and got ready for the day. At exactly 6:25, Edward took a deep breath and walked inside. Sam was a big Greek man, probably 60 years old, with gray hair and hands that looked like they'd spent decades doing hard physical work. He looked up when Edward entered, studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly like he'd been expecting him. "You Edward Carter?" Sam asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Edward said quietly. "Mr. Johnson told me to come see you about work." "Yeah, Bumpy called me last night," Sam said. "Told me you'd be coming, told me you needed a job and that you'd work hard if somebody gave you a chance. Told me about your situation, about your mother, about everything. So let me tell you something, Edward. I don't care what you did before today. I don't care that you're a drunk, or that you lived on the streets, or that you hit your mother, or any of that. What happened before this moment doesn't matter to me. What matters is whether you show up on time, whether you do the work I need done, whether you cause problems, or whether you keep your head down and earn your pay. You show up every day, you work hard, you keep your mouth shut, you'll get paid every Friday. $25 cash, no taxes taken out. You don't show up, you come in drunk, you cause trouble with my other workers, you're gone, and Bumpy will hear about it, and you won't like what happens next. We clear on all that?" "We're clear, sir," Edward said, his voice stronger now. "I'll work hard. I'll show up every day. I won't cause problems. I promise." Sam studied Edward's face, saw something there that satisfied him. "All right, then. Come with me." The work was brutal. Sam took Edward out to the alley behind the restaurant, where a truck was already waiting with the morning delivery. 6 massive blocks of ice, each weighing at least 100 pounds, that needed to be carried from the truck to the ice house, where they'd keep the restaurant's food cold. Edward's body, weakened from years of alcohol and poor nutrition, screamed in protest as he lifted the first block. His back spasmed, his arms trembled, his legs nearly buckled under the weight. But he gritted his teeth and carried the ice block the 20 feet from the truck to the ice house, feeling like his spine might snap, like his legs might give out, like his body might simply refuse to do what he was demanding of it. But he did it. He carried all 6 ice blocks, one at a time, taking rest breaks between each one. His clothes soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature, his muscles burning, his breath coming in gasps. When the last block was in place, Edward leaned against the wall of the ice house, certain he was about to collapse, certain that his body couldn't possibly do another task. Sam appeared in the doorway. Good. Now there's 50-pound sacks of flour and rice that need to be moved from the loading dock to the storage room. 20 sacks total. Then the breakfast dishes start, coming in around 7, and they don't stop until 11. Then lunch dishes from 11:30 to 2. Then you mop the floors, take out the garbage, clean the bathrooms, and help prep for tomorrow. Your shift ends at 3:30. Let's go. The first day was hell incarnate. Edward's body, which hadn't done meaningful physical labor in 15 years, rebelled at every task. His hands blistered from carrying the flour sacks. His back seized up from bending over the dish sink. His feet, unaccustomed to standing for 9 hours straight, developed blisters that made every step agony. By noon, he was seriously considering whether dying might be easier than continuing this work. By 2 p.m. he was crying while washing dishes, tears mixing with the scalding water and the sweat pouring off his face, his body telling him to quit, to give up, to go find a bottle and forget about all of this. But every time he thought about quitting, he remembered Bumpy Johnson's face, inches from his, remembered the slap that had split his lip, remembered the threat of what would happen if he failed. And more than that, he remembered his mother's face, remembered the bruise he'd put there, remembered her living in an apartment with no heat and no electricity while he drank away what little money he could steal. That shame, that guilt, that absolute rock-bottom recognition of what he'd become, that's what kept him going when his body wanted to quit. At 3:30 p.m., Sam came over to where Edward was mopping the floors. "That's your shift, Edward. You can go home." Edward leaned on the mop, barely able to stand. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Sam studied him for a moment. "You did good today. Work was hard. You complained some, but you didn't quit. That's what matters. You come back tomorrow, 6:30 a.m., and do it again. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Edward said. "I'll be here." And he was. Edward showed up at 6:30 the next morning, his entire body aching, his hands covered in bandages where the blisters had been the day before, his feet so swollen he could barely get his shoes on. He showed up the day after that, and the day after that. Each day was agony. Each day his body screamed for alcohol, for the relief that a bottle would provide, for the escape from pain that drinking offered. But each day he resisted, not because he was strong, but because the fear of what Bumpy Johnson would do if he failed was stronger than the desire to drink. By the end of the first week, Edward's hands had developed calluses instead of blisters. His back still ached, but no longer spasmed with every movement. His arms no longer trembled when he lifted the ice blocks. His body was remembering how to work, was adapting to the demands being placed on it, was becoming functional again after years of abuse and neglect. Friday came. At 3:30 p.m., after Edward had finished his shift, Sam called him into the small office in the back of the restaurant. "You made it through your first week," Sam said, pulling an envelope from his desk drawer. "Showed up every day on time. Did the work without causing problems. That's what I need from my workers." He handed Edward the envelope. $25. Count it if you want." Edward's hands shook as he took the envelope, not from alcohol withdrawal now, but from emotion, from the overwhelming feeling of having earned something honestly for the first time in years. He opened the envelope and stared at the bills inside. 5 $5 bills. $25. More money than he'd held honestly in over a decade. Money that was his because he'd worked for it, because he'd earned it through sweat and pain and persistence, because someone had paid him for doing something productive instead of money he'd begged or stolen or manipulated out of people. "Thank you, Mr. Sam," Edward said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me this chance." "Don't thank me," Sam said gruffly. "Thank Bumpy. He's the one who asked me to hire you, and remember what you're supposed to do with some of that money. You remember what Bumpy told you?" "Yes, sir," Edward said. $10 to my mother every Friday. I remember." Edward walked from Sam's restaurant to his mother's apartment at 347 West 134th Street, climbing the 4 flights of stairs slowly because his legs ached and his feet hurt, and because he was terrified of what he'd find when he knocked on her door. Would she be afraid of him? Would she refuse to see him? Would she call for help, thinking he was there to hurt her again? He knocked gently, heard movement inside the apartment, heard his mother's voice asking, "Who is it?" with fear in her tone. "It's Edward, Ma," he said through the door. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not drunk. I'm here to give you something. Please open the door." The door opened slowly, Elizabeth peering out through the gap, ready to slam it shut if Edward showed any sign of aggression or intoxication. But what she saw was her son, clean, shaved, sober, looking more like the Edward she remembered from 20 years ago than the drunk who'd hit her 2 weeks earlier. "Ma," Edward said, his voice shaking, "I got a job. Mr. Johnson got me a job at Sam's restaurant. I worked all week. I just got paid." He pulled $10 from the envelope and held it out to her. "This is for you, to help with your bills. I'm going to give you $10 every Friday from now on, every single Friday as long as I'm working. I promise. And Ma, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for hitting you, for stealing from you, for being the worst son any mother ever had. I can't take back what I did, but I can try to be better from now on. I can try to become the man you raised me to be instead of the drunk I became. So please, take this money. Let me start making things right." Elizabeth Carter stared at her son, saw that his eyes were clear for the first time in years, saw that his hands were steady, saw that he was telling the truth. She took the money with shaking hands, and then, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, she stepped forward and hugged her son, really hugged him, the way a mother hugs a child she thought she'd lost, but who might somehow be finding his way back home. "Edward," she whispered, crying into his shoulder, "my boy, my Edward, you came back to me." They stood there in the doorway for a long time, mother and son both crying, both holding on to each other like they were afraid to let go, both understanding that this was fragile, that Edward's sobriety was new and could collapse at any moment, but also understanding that this moment was real, that for right now Edward was sober and working and trying to be better, and that maybe, just maybe, the boy Elizabeth had raised was still in there somewhere fighting to survive. Edward worked at Sam's restaurant for 11 years without missing a single day. Every Friday at 3:30 p.m., he'd collect his $25 from Sam, and every Friday at 4 p.m. he'd climb the stairs to apartment 4B at 347 West 134th Street and hand his mother $10. He stayed sober not because the desire to drink ever disappeared, it never did, not really, but because the fear of disappointing his mother and the fear of facing Bumpy Johnson's wrath if he failed were stronger than the desire for alcohol. In 1952, Sam promoted Edward to assistant manager, increasing his pay to $40 a week. Edward still gave his mother $10 every Friday, but now he had $30 for himself, enough to rent a small apartment instead of sleeping in flophouses, enough to buy proper clothes, enough to start building something resembling a normal life. In 1955, Elizabeth Carter fell ill with pneumonia. By then, she was 80 years old. her body worn out from decades of poverty and hard work. Edward visited her every evening after work, brought her soup from Sam's restaurant, sat with her while she slept, held her hand while she struggled to breathe. When she died on March 3, 1955, Edward had been sober for 8 years, had saved enough money to give her a proper funeral, had become the son she'd deserved instead of the drunk who'd hit her for money. At Elizabeth's funeral at Mount Olivet Baptist Church, Edward stood at the front with his mother's coffin, looking out at the small gathering of people who'd come to pay respects, neighbors from her building, a few women she'd worked with decades earlier, the minister who'd known her for years. And standing in the very back of the church, almost invisible in the shadows, was Bumpy Johnson. After the service, as people filed out, Edward approached Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming. It would have meant a lot to my mother." Johnson nodded slightly. "She was a good woman, Edward. She survived things that would have killed most people. She deserved better than what life gave her." "She got better at the end," Edward said, "because of you. Because you gave me that chance 8 years ago. Because you scared me straight and got me that job. I was able to take care of her these last years. She didn't die cold and hungry like she almost did before you helped us. She died warm, in a clean apartment, with her son who loved her sitting beside her. That's because of what you did, Mr. Johnson. I can never repay you for that." Johnson was quiet for a moment. "You repaid me by showing up every day at Sam's, by staying sober, by giving your mother that $10 every Friday for 8 years, by becoming the man she raised you to be, instead of staying the drunk who hit her. That's payment enough, Edward. You took the chance I gave you, and you didn't waste it. Most people waste their chances. You didn't. That matters." Edward Carter worked at Sam's restaurant until 1958, when he'd saved enough money to buy a small grocery store on 138th Street. He ran that grocery store for another 15 years, never drank again, never raised his hand to anyone, lived a quiet, decent life that would have been impossible without the intervention of a gangster who'd decided that even drunks who hit their mothers deserved one chance at redemption if they were willing to work for it. And every year on February 4th, the anniversary of the day his mother had stopped Bumpy Johnson's car in the street to beg for one bread, Edward Carter walked to the Palm Cafe on 125th Street and left an envelope at the bar. Inside was always a note that said simply, "Thank you for giving me my life back," and $50 in cash, which was about all that Edward could afford, but which he gave anyway because some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged with whatever gratitude and generosity the debtor can manage.